Welcome to Tea Talks Unfiltered, the podcast where we drink tea, we talk, and they're both unfiltered. My name is Jake, and I will be your host. And on today's episode, we are going back to drinking some pu'er tea, and we are going to be discussing students, coaches, disciples, and masters. And answering the question that's on everybody's mind: how and when do I become a Kungfu Master? All right. So that is a very loaded question, a heck of a way to start off a podcast. But today I want to go through that terminology and its use, not only in the martial arts school within Taoism, but also within and throughout Chinese culture. Because there's a really big impact on the use of names, and there's a very important power and significance to each one. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the ranking system that we do use in the martial arts school, the problems with that, the progression through it, also the process of becoming a disciple. And then I want to leave you with some words and my perspective on what it really takes to become a Shifu, to become a master. So it's going to be quite the journey. So I'm glad you joined me, and cheers. All right. So to get started, I do want to set the scene with a short story. Okay, it's kind of an anecdote, really. So as most of these stories begin, we begin with the potential student approaching the master to ask a question. And so he comes to the school and he approaches Shifu and he says, "How long will it take for me to finish training if I join today?" And the Shifu thinks and he looks at the student and he goes, 5 years. And the potential student thinks to himself, he says, 5 years is a big commitment. There's quite a lot that can happen in that much time. I could start a career, start a family. It's a big dedication to do that. And so he thinks, and he's very serious, and he goes back to the Shifu and he says, "Now, I'm a very diligent student, Shifu, and I will work really hard. I will do work outside of classes. I will be your best student. I will do my best to learn everything you teach as perfectly as I can. How long will it take me to finish?" And the Shifu looks at him and he waits and he thinks and he says, 10 years. And so this is kind of the lesson of the story, very obvious, kind of smack you in the face type idea, that it's not about the quantity. It's really about the quality. And the people are always trying to look for those shortcuts, always trying to jump to the head of everything. It ends up undoing a lot of the work that they do, right? So this is a really simple story. It doesn't really give you a lot of depth. It doesn't really give you a lot of context for everything, but it does give you the base idea of, while time is valuable, it's also the intention and the character that you build with that you carry through that whole process. So I want to kind of keep that idea as we move forward and go into these different terminologies and explain the process, because there is a process, right? You do go from student, you do build up to a certain level, and at some point there is a day where potentially you become a Shifu. And so there is a process, but I want to explain it in its context because it's not as straightforward as most people assume. Okay? So let's roll it back and let's begin with the most simple terms. Everyone is really familiar around the world with the use of terminology like student and teacher, right? This is very universal. We have a lot of connotation already attached to these terms. We use them with a sense of respect, with a sense of responsibility, a sense of obedience even. So it's not something that just gets used lightly. It's used in a certain situation, a certain environment, and it's meant to cater a certain relationship. So you use that title to your teacher to show respect and to kind of set the scene that you're here to learn, and this is the relationship. This is the boundaries that you're setting, right? And so there's a lot of power in those words. As we move on to these different terminologies, there's always going to be that kind of cultural kind of social influence on the power of words, the power of your vocabulary. But it gets a lot deeper than just, for example, sir and ma'am and teacher and student. It goes a lot deeper than that. But that is the starting point. So if we think about that idea, we think about how we treat a teacher and that relationship and how that differs from the average person or even a parent or a close peer. There is a certain amount of integrity that comes with that position. And it's almost by default, right? You view that relationship differently. You remember your teachers for a very long time, but you remember them kind of as an icon, kind of a symbol of what you were learning, what you were doing, what they were expressing or teaching to you at that time. And they're kind of almost separate from their real identity as a person, which is always an interesting thing. I was listening to someone talk about, running into your teacher outside of school is always a very strange experience, because you're like, wait, you're not supposed to be out here. You're only supposed to be in school. And there's this kind of dissonance that happens, but very funny. But there is that idea that there is a responsibility between the two. With a martial arts school, that responsibility is going to be even greater. Okay, that bond, that connection, that relationship is taken a lot more seriously, even on the base level, because of the nature of the learning process of what we're trying to cultivate, what we're trying to build. Okay, so speaking about these titles, I would be remiss to not mention the influence of Chinese culture and the way titles are very important in everyday society. So in the West, typically, like for English names, for example, we always place the name first and the surname last. And so a very easy example we can start with is talking about how in China, you introduce yourself with the surname first. So every time you see a Chinese name, it's reversed, right? You have the family name, you have that character first, and then you have the personal name. And very often, the family name is what people go by. And so, for example, if you had a teacher, that's also very common. You might say teacher Johnson. You might use their last name to identify them, not just as a teacher, but also as this teacher, as this surname, right? And so that's very similar in Chinese, but it's also all the way across the board with most people. The way you introduce is you lead with the surname. So there's this kind of identity, there's this marker that carries forward your reputation, that precedes your personal interest, that precedes your personal side, right? And we go much deeper than that, because one of the most important things in China is this family bond, right? This connection. And anyone knows anything, if you've studied anything about traveling in China, you know that a very large part of the culture, the history, is centered around taking care of your elders and also paying respects to your ancestors. There's always this kind of paying it backwards type idea, where you're always trying to take care of them. You're trying to show respect of the ones who came before you, whether that's in the family, whether that's in your job, whether that's in your education. There's always this very direct practice of the new generation taking the inferior position naturally and following the word of their elders in any situation. There is this kind of standard that's set, and that's reflected in the way that this terminology is used. So, for example, in English, we have titles. We also use these. There is that kind of, you don't call your parents by their first name, of course. But Chinese goes a little bit more deep into that idea. And but every single relationship in the family has a specific title, right? And so there's a word for your younger, your elder, your brother, your sister, also for your parents, also for your parents' family. there are different terms. So your uncle on your mom's family and the uncle on your dad's family will have a different title. It gets so kind of structured and built in this kind of hierarchy that it's even an interesting kind of social activity when you're first getting together with distant relatives, where everyone's trying to piece together what should we be calling each other, because it gets to the point where in these reunions, in these situations within family circles and social circles, you refer to each other a lot of times by their title. So very rarely do you call someone by their name. Only if they're in a position that's inferior to you. They're a younger generation, right? Then you call them by their name. So, for example, your children, you would call by their name, or your younger siblings, maybe. But predominantly everyone's using the titles. So even for me personally, for a very long time, I didn't know the actual names of my in-laws, my wife's parents. And the only reason I learned them was because we had to do paperwork to be married. And so I had to learn their names to fill out paperwork. But otherwise, I've never referred to them by their personal name, because that's kind of, it's not proper. It's not proper etiquette to do that. And so you're always referring to them as a title. So for example, your aunts, if you have on your mother's side, she has sisters. The eldest of those sisters, you would call the big aunt. And going down from there, you would have your second aunt, your third aunt, and however many. And then the final one would be the small aunt. And so you refer to them, that is their title. So when you have get-togethers, when you have meals, there's kind of this title that you start every conversation with, the way you refer to each other. And I think that really sets up the relationship very quickly. It sets up the flow of power in some situations, if you're talking about career, or even if you're talking about more serious family situations. It sets up kind of the who is the leader in this situation a little bit. And a lot of the culture is structured around that as well. So based on the title, you also know who should be served first. You know who should sit in the best position. You know who should be taken care of the most. There's all these kind of relationships that's bound up in that terminology that is very quickly associated in everyone's mind because of the normalcy of it, right? It's very, very common to use these terms, right? It's it's the standard, right? Even so much so to where if you are outside, the polite terminology, no one uses like sir and ma'am. I remember when I first came to China, I was reading these like translation books, like Lonely Planet type stuff, to learn the polite way to talk to people and to do certain things. And there's always this, if you say hello in Chinese, it's ni hao. And if you want to be polite, you say nin you add an N at the end of the ni, nin hao. And I have never heard someone say this in 11 years of being here. I've never heard that used. And when I first came here, I tried to use it like nonstop because I was like, I need to be polite. I don't know anybody. And no one understood what I was saying. No one even understood hello because it didn't click and my pronunciation was horrible. So there's this kind of idea that there's polite terminology, but it's rarely used. What is used is including strangers in your family tree. So what I mean by that is these titles that you're given within the family, whether that's, for example, older sister or aunt or grandmother on the mom's side, for example. These terms are very quickly used for interactions with strangers. Like if you bump into someone, you might say, excuse me, maybe not to that degree, but maybe especially if they help you or if they're being polite in some way, or a lot of times with children, you will have them refer to the elders that you meet on the street with a family term, even though there's no blood connection. You might not even really be real familiar with them, but it's kind of a very polite thing to do. And so I remember a good piece of advice is if you're traveling and a Chinese family starts to teach you how to call them by their family names, then that's a really good sign that they're being really polite. They're welcoming you into their home. And that's a really good kind of marker to know that the relationship is growing. And so with that, you want to follow the standard, and you want to be able to kind of communicate that way. That way you can be on bar with everybody, right? So throughout Chinese culture, that hierarchy, that kind of title leading is really, really important, and it's really ingrained all throughout society. So that is a really important thing to understand, the kind of stress and the importance of that. Now, as we move into martial arts, we move into the Kung Fu school, or maybe in more traditional settings, specifically a temple even, right? These places are, in their structure, essentially they are surrogate homes. They are places where people come and they choose to enter a family. You're going to have these new bonds with people that you're learning with, you're training with, you're cultivating with. It's a very connected, tight-knit group. And so it makes sense that this group also has its own familial terms, right? With these terms, there's also kind of a greater importance. There's a bigger significance and kind of connection to each other with these. I think it comes with a deeper sense of respect and gratitude, and also responsibility. So there's also a lot more that's required of you in some sense once you start being part of this community and using this terminology. Okay. So within the martial arts school, we have a few terms. We have, for your elder Kung Fu brothers, we have Shishong. For younger, we have Xiongdi. For your Shifu, your master, of course, everyone knows. But you also have a terminology for your Kung Fu uncle. So the class that your master trained with, who may also be teaching, you would refer to them as Shishu, which is like your martial art uncle. And then we have Shiye, which is the grandmaster, grandpa. So there is this hierarchy that's kind of copied over and used in the martial arts community. That way each other's relationship as well. Because again, that generation, that lineage is very important to kind of be able to place where you are, who you learned from, how long you've been learning. These kinds of things are really important because it's a really good kind of handshake. It's kind of like when you introduce yourself, you're not only introducing yourself, you're also introducing your clan, you're introducing your reputation, your history, and there's a lot of weight that's carried with that name. So we use these. After all, when we start using this terminology and referring to each other as a Kung Fu brother or as an elder or as your master, there is a lot of meaning tied with that. And these terms must be used. There are no close connections. You're not supposed to refer to people by names in these situations because it's too casual, and it kind of invites a breaking down of those responsibilities. And so traditionally speaking, you do really want to stick to this etiquette, right? So if we think back, you might have the right intention, but expressed intention is done through words. Words create your actions in time. Those actions create your habits. Those habits are what is the foundation of etiquette, of good etiquette. And only through etiquette is how we guide ourselves to benevolence. Okay. So that is kind of the very kind of Confucius founded structure that we're trying to emulate within the martial arts school, and also within the family. Like this is kind of the standard all the way across the culture in China. Okay. A word on that real quickly. I want to share a few of my own thoughts because this ties in very closely to the idea of respect. And I want to clarify what that means, kind of your contribution, your standard of giving respect, I think is very important, because there's a lot of, again, connotation tied to this term in the West. And I think that there's a way that we should view giving respect, and the way that we should review kind of receiving it, and understanding what that relationship means. And so what I want to kind of explain is the different types of respect. Okay, so bear with me for a moment. My perspective is like this. Earned respect is not true respect. At its best, earning respect, having a situation where you're almost requiring people, you have to earn my respect before I will give it to you. You have to earn it. You have to do something to make you worthy of it. I think that this is false, because at its best, like, say the person does earn your respect, and in the best case scenario, the reason they're doing this is just an aspiration. It's just kind of a reason for them to be a role model. It is this kind of standard that you've placed, arbitrarily you've created, and now they met that goal, so now you give the respect. So earning isn't really true respect. That's something that, they've accomplished, not something that you've given. Okay? So I think that at its best, it's okay, but it's only following by example, which can very easily lead to just desire. And you might not actually respect, you might just desire that position. You want to emulate it as best you can. At its worst, it's desire. I got my notes over here just to make sure that I got everything straight, because this is kind of something I wrote down a very long time ago. Yeah, so at its worst, it is desire for coveting the possessions of another, to be able to just accomplish what they have exactly, and potentially do better even. The next idea is that required respect. Requiring respect, I think, is definitely something that's not really true. It's kind of this over control. And there are situations where even if you require respect, you demand obedience. You demand to be the superior, so that way people will follow you and learn from you. At its best, that's a ritual. It's a ritual. It's a standard just to guide you, hopefully, towards something good. Right? Hopefully the person that is requiring your respect can benefit you in some way, like a drill sergeant. Yeah, they require you to respect them. Hopefully they're teaching you something good, and hopefully they're guiding you in the correct way. So it can be good, but at its worst, it could just lead to fear. And you're not really respecting this person. You're just afraid of the consequences. And so I think that's like holding respect at knife point. And it's like, oh, you better respect me, or else what? Well, I'm going to do something to you. It's not really freely given. Which brings me to the only true form of respect. And I think that true respect, much like charity, must be freely given, without requirement, without expectation, without need, without reward. And I think that this is kind of the natural state. I think that there are guidelines to help you kind of feel that. If we talk about the etiquette, like Confucius talks about, there are etiquettes, there are standards, there are kind of like system guidelines. But all those are just kind of the map. You really have to put your own best foot forward and show that you're willing to respect without the requirement of a reward, without the requirement of reciprocation. After all, respect is the best gift when given freely, and it is also best when freely returned. So it is kind of that grace. It has to be gracefully given. It's like giving a gift to someone. You don't expect something back, but when you do get something back, it's like, wow, this is really great. And that's a connection. And so I think that we should specify what kind of respect we are engaging in. While earned respect is good, you have to be careful you're not setting your standards too high. While required respect is good to guide people, it can be overexertive. It can be over-controlling and overbearing on the students in this case. So I think the only true respect must be freely given, and it must be a two-way road. You must give what you receive, right? So that's kind of my notes. So now that we're talking about this and we've got kind of the culture, the etiquette out of the way, I hope that context is kind of bringing new light into the martial arts dojo, into the school. I do want to talk about the ranking system that we do use, because now we have kind of this title, we have kind of the structure, the framework. So how do we stand? How do we take our place, our position, our proper, location in that structure, in that hierarchy? And really, there are no significant ranking systems. There's no black belt system. There's no level 1, level 2. There's no tiers. There's no real accomplishment where, you are directly compared to another person. Besides time. And so the only real identifier that we have in the school for your place within it, within the lineage, is when you began. Not age, when you began training martial arts, or when you joined the academy, when you decided to become part of the Sanfeng Pai, in our case. And that is the only real marker. So those who come before you, regardless of age, if they started last year, they are referred as your older Kung Fu brother. And you are the new guy. You're the newbie, right? So you have to follow suit. And I think that this is not a perfect system, because we're not taking into consideration talent, skill, accomplishment, ability. And also, in today's world, there's the added unbalancing part of the amount of time someone spends at the school. So you also have people who might come and train, but then they go back into society, they go back into a career, while you have someone who maybe came later, but they trained for, a much more in-depth period of time. So there's still problems with this issue. I think a lot of those are new. I think those are kind of modern problems. Just because back in the old days, when you join the temple, when you join the school, for the most part, that is now your life. That is now everything. So you live, you breathe, you train all in one place. And if someone comes after you, naturally they're going to be playing catch up. They're going to be, trying to catch up to you for a long time because you don't leave that place. You cultivate, you continue your practice. It's a lifelong commitment. And so I think a lot of those issues that we're dealing with are more modern, which is why a lot of these systems have started with ranking and belt systems. And some of that's also tied very closely to sport and competition and things like that. But within most of the traditional schools here, there really is no rank or system. It's really just time. Who came before you, that's your elder. And I think that some of that is really nice because that allows you to come into a situation and just accept and just humble yourself and just begin your own practice. You don't really need to worry about these different dimensions. Even if you spar with your elder Kung Fu brother, it's expected that you do your best, and it might be better. So there's kind of this newer dynamic that is interesting, that there's not really a perfect ranking system, but we also don't use a bell system or something like that. The one distinction that we can use within the school, besides just your Sixiong or your Shifu, who came before you, what generation you're a part of, like if you're a part of Master Yan's generation, okay, you're all uncles now because you've trained not only before me in this class, before me in the generation. So you have that marker. But besides this, the only other distinction that we can really make is becoming a disciple. Talking about disciples, Master Yan once talked to us in our class about the distinction is very similar to an outside and an inside student. You have those kind of like outer door students and you have those inner door students. And this is kind of how we talked about disciples and how everyone is free to learn the same things. There are no secret teachings. There are no real pieces of information that we're going to hold back from the general student group, right? The only difference is those inner students, in this case, the disciples. That responsibility is greater. And because of that, the relationship and the bond between disciple to master is stronger than that to student and master. Just because the responsibility of a disciple is to transmit the teachings, is to continue their practice, their research, their self-cultivation, and continually transmit that to the next generation. Because of that, there is more emphasis placed on that bond. And so when we say inner student, we don't really necessarily mean that Sifu has like a secret scroll that he's going to bring out and show us all the hidden techniques. It's not really that. It's that if there's ever a question, if there's ever a doubt, if there's ever a place where we can assist each other or where Sifu can come and help guide us, that connection is greater. That significance is much more important. Because now we've not just come and trained under him, but we've also committed. We've ordained ourselves in some way to following him, So I do want to talk for a moment about the disciple ceremony and what that's like, kind of the process of it. Just because this is an interesting way to introduce that. I thought about doing a whole entire episode about that, but I think I can cover the details of it here rather quickly. So, becoming a disciple. I became a disciple along with my class and the first group of disciples that Master Yuan accepted in 2012. At this time, I had been practicing for about 2.5 years. And Sifu approached the students and said that, now he's going to start accepting disciples. And for us in the program, this was always kind of the goal, kind of the direction that we were working towards. Because the program was set up from 3 to 5 years. 3 years would be like, you are going to become, disciple. You are going to become kind of a coach. Like you're going to be pretty well-rounded in all the foundation skills. You're going to be able to teach. And 5 years is going to be, you're going to complete the curriculum. You're going to be proficient in all the different systems that we do and able to teach anything. And so, you just leave here with the full system. And so because that's the goal of everyone who's really going through the program, there wasn't really many people who said, I'm only going to be here for 3 years. There were people who changed plans, but it wasn't necessarily that was their plan from the beginning, right? And so we all were going in this direction. And so when Sifu said he was going to accept disciples, it was like for us, it was kind of a given. It was like, we've been expecting this. And it was very exciting to make that official. Because before the disciple ceremonies, Sifu used to talk about how it's not really the most important part of the relationship for him. For him, the discipleship is more like a piece of paper. It's more like a public announcement, like a distinction that you need to carry on the lineage, on paper, historically, within society. But I think that Sifu does do his best to teach everyone that comes willing to learn. Everyone who can make a commitment, whether it be a conversation, a week, a year, a life. I think that when approached, Sifu does his best to offer assistance to what's appropriate at the time. And so it's very natural for us to, utilize that relationship as much as we can. Becoming disciples means that we're going to carry on the next generation, and we're going to kind of solidify that bond between us and Sifu. So I suppose if we start our schools and we start teaching, there's always this connection where if we need help, if we have doubts or we need questions answered, I think that Sifu will always be there for us. And that's definitely part of it. And I think that bond was already there before our discipleship. But again, that discipleship was kind of our announcement to the world that, we are committed to this. It's not just that we showed up and we're interested. It's that we're willing to go through the process. So discipleship ceremony was in the early part of the year. I believe it was on March 9th, which is kind of a special day. I'll have to look and make sure that's the day, because we have a couple events every year. It's on March 9th now, but I'm pretty sure that first one was also on March 9th. 3-9, very Daoist significant number. Gets used for a lot of holidays. There's a lot of numerology throughout the year for other events as well. But we would have our ceremony. Now, our lineage is not really focused on the religious parts of practice. There is a kind of homage, paying it backward to the ancestors, and kind of this respect for the lineage and the responsibility of the transmission of the practices. And there is definitely the culture of Taoism kind of enshrouding the whole ceremony. But we are not like a religious Taoist set where we're climbing the mountain to go to specific temples to do these rituals or to do our chanting or things like that. It's more of a martial arts academy. So when we did our ceremony, we're pledging our allegiance in a way to the lineage. So we have a shrine built to Zhang Sanfeng, which is the originator, the namesake of our lineage, Sanfeng Pai. So Zhang Sanfeng Pai, Zhang Sanfeng lineage, basically. And he is the legendary creator of Taiji. And so our lineage is, spawned from teachers to teachers, 16th generations down to my generation. And first off, we're pledging allegiance to this. So we go through the ceremony. We, prostrate before the shrine. We burn incense. We offer our kind of like pledge of allegiance, actually. So we have like a certain phrases that for us were prepared because we didn't all speak fluent Chinese. And so we had like a Chinese kind of promise that was dictated for us, and we memorized that and repeated that, basically talking about our commitment. Everyone had a little bit different, but talking about our commitment for the lineage and how we're going to do our best to transmit the teachings and to honor them and to keep them in their full context and continue our own practice. And we do this first to the lineage, to the Zhang Sanfeng Shrine, and then we also pay respects to Master Yuan as being our Shifu, being our leader, our connection to the lineage. So Sifu being the 15th generation holder, basically granting us the next generation status. And that is done through, of course, prostrating, kind of bowing before Sifu, and also the exchange of the red bag, and Sifu gives you a certificate and actually a sword, a ceremonial sword that has your name inscribed into it. the name is probably the most significant part of that. Everyone has a Chinese name, so you kind of get your Daoist name. You kind of get reordained with a name that identifies you within the lineage, right? So now we are all 4 characters. We have 4 characters, 4 Chinese characters for our name. My name is Ping Mao Zigen. And so the Ping takes the place of my family name. So it's a phonetic exchange for Pinnick. So instead of Pinnick, we have Ping. Ping means it means balance, right? And so it's just kind of a normal surname, a common surname, but not too common because there's not too many P sounding words in Chinese. But so I've got Ping for my first name, just kind of to identify my family. You always have that marker first. Second character, Mao. The Mao actually refers to like capital and resources, but it is my Shifu's Daoist name. So Shifu Yuan Shugang is his name, but his Daoist name is Yuan Shi Mao. So he has his family name that stays in his Daoist name. Then he has his generation name, and then he has his personal name. He has 3 names. Up until the 16th generation, everyone only has 3 names. But now, because of the wide transmission of disciples and kind of the more access that people have to Wudang, there are many more disciples. So to clarify things, the masters all added the 4th character, which basically says who your teacher is. So my first name says my family name, Ping. My second character, Mao, is my teacher. So my second character is actually Sifu's personal name. So when you say Ping Mao, everyone knows, oh, Mao, you're from Yuan Shi Mao, you're from his class. So you have that identifier, that reputation marker, right? Third character, Zi. Zi is the 16th generation character. So everyone in the 16th generation of Sanfeng Pai has this character in their name. These characters are actually really interesting the way they do it. There's actually a poem that is kind of the classic of our lineage, where we get all of our names from. And if you count the characters in this transcription, the 16th character is Zi. So you can actually, if you have this poem, you can also kind of identify the generations by their names. So there's kind of a marker there. So we have family, teacher, generation. Final name, again, my final name means roots, like the roots of a tree. And that is your personal name. That is the name that Sifu gives to you. In some cases, it could be handpicked. In others, it also could be derived from a classic, from poetry, from some other source that he could be using personally. So in my case, mine is roots, which I really like because that is kind of the whole reason why I came to China to learn martial arts, was to find the roots, and I became them. No, but that is my Daoist name, Ping Mao Zigen. So you can see through that name with our explanation how the importance is placed on each character. And in this case, if I was to become a teacher and I was strictly speaking Chinese all the time, in some cases people could call me like Ping Jialian, because that's my surname. That's what I lead with. Most people refer to me as Jake, as Jake in Chinese. So that also depends. Modern take on society. But from that point, we have now solidified our relationship with Master Yan, with the lineage. And there is a lot more responsibility in that. So there's, within the booklet that we're given, we read through the rules and the kind of regulations that we must abide by. And for the most part, we do already. We already kind of honor Sifu. We try to take care of that relationship. He's always the most important person in the room when we're together. And so there is this kind of, you're always paying respect. You're always trying to take care of that relationship, because the responsibility is on you. The responsibility is on you as a disciple, as a student, to maintain that good relationship. But this responsibility is two ways, because by becoming a disciple, Shifu, in this case, Master Yan, is also solidifying his responsibility to you as a master. It's not just a one-way street of we must follow, we must do, we must prepare everything. There is also this responsibility that is given back that says, not only do you promise to take this position, but the teacher also promises to uplift you and to teach you and to guide you as best they can. And so there is this two-way respect, two-way responsibility that I think takes place. Not necessarily during that event, but definitely around it. Definitely, that is kind of what fills the ceremony. Okay. So that is how you become a disciple. Short and sweet, anyway. Now, what does make a Shifu? So at this point, we have the underlying structure of the school. We have those relationships between your older Kung Fu brothers, your uncles, your master, your grandmaster. You have outer and inner students. You have students and you have disciples. It makes sense that at a certain point, when these disciples take on that responsibility of transmitting the arts as they set out to do, at some point there is a distinction that occurs and they become masters. Now, there is a structured way that one becomes a master. And I'm going to go over a few different concepts about being a master because I think understanding it in its full context is very important. The first one, very simple, the kind of most basic requirement of becoming a master is having students, is having your own school. That is kind of the prerequisite identifier that once those things are there, once you are established and you have that reputation, you naturally kind of are granted the title of Sifu, because now it just means that now you have this responsibility. Not only do you aspire to this responsibility as a disciple does, but you have this responsibility. You have these relationships you must take care of. You have these students that you must cultivate and grow and guide. And so there's kind of, okay, that is the structured way of becoming a Sifu. You have ordained disciples. Obviously you're going to be the master because that is the standard relationship that has happened. But I do think that there is a very big importance on being recognized as a disciple. Being recognized as a master and not claiming it. I think that there is a very important aspect to that evolution, so to say. And I want to share with you a story real quick about even how the terminology of master has changed over the years. Something that seems kind of so traditional in sense and so bound up in history and this kind of etiquette. The term master has even seen changes. One day talking with Sifu recently, actually, he told me this story, which I never really thought about before. And he pointed that out at the beginning, that a lot of people don't think like this anymore. They have forgotten the way a real traditional relationship goes with a Sifu. And he explained to me that when he was younger, a true Shifu, the way that the relationship would go would not really be tied up in a school, which is interesting because I think that the kind of parameters set up in a school system, when there is a tuition, there is kind of this structure, because there's other factors to you becoming a student, like tuition, like these fees, like this exchange. This is a transaction now. Because of that situation, that environment, very quickly there becomes this requirement of the teacher to, do something, be held up to some kind of standard. And it becomes a transactional relationship. I think that's a very modern thing, and I never really thought about it on that zoomed out perspective before. But what Shifu explained to me was, traditionally, if you wanted a master to teach your children, for example, it wouldn't be you send them to a school, you pay tuition, and you expect results. What it would be inviting that master into your home and having them live with you as an honored guest while you give them permission to beat your children. No, not that aggressive, but definitely there was this idea that, there were masters, and, you might see them, you might respect what they do, you might really look for that for your children. And what would really happen is you would invite them to your home, and they might stay for a month, 3 months, half a year, solely for the tutelage, the education of your child. And Shifu, the character, Fu, the second character in Shifu, means father. It is a role model position. And there's a lot of importance placed on that character, because the position that the Shifu, the position that the master is taking by entering your household, is one of the honored guest. And what the guest says is always right. And so there's kind of this, regardless of the, how would you say, the family connection and that kind of community, regardless of the different hierarchy that's already established in the family, once there's a guest that you've invited into your house, because they're invited, now they kind of have the honored position. The guest is a very honored position. Like we talked about with the tea ceremony in the first talk, about how a lot of the imagery, a lot of the balance of the room is catered towards the guest, very similar in these kind of relationships. And so not only are they in this case, your children's teacher, they are also the guest. And so other responsibilities are taken. The student in this case would take care of washing clothes, take care of meal times, take care of cooking, take care of looking after the needs of the master while he lives in the home. So there might not be a direct exchange of money or tuition, but it is kind of this, everything is taken care of. You live in our home while you live here. You take care of this education, you take care of the training and the guidance of the child, and we take care of all of your needs, and we set you up, we establish you, and we honor you while you're here. If you want your feet washed, if you want new sheets, if you need your own room, your own space, there's always this kind of, the best place to sit at dinner. There is this kind of like honoring that position. And that's definitely something that's been lost. That's not a standard even throughout China anymore, because of just the nature of society and the growth of the population and the way things change. Now it is definitely like a schooling system, and it's not private home tutoring and things like that. So this is developed and changed, but with that, we also bring a lot of new influence to this terminology, and those relationships, I think, are very subject to change. But it's important to understand the principle and the traditional implications of what being a master is, the responsibilities of a student, the responsibilities of a disciple, and also the responsibilities of the master. So, one other reference from the Tao Te Ching, we also say that one who doesn't take credit for anything can never be in the wrong. And so we have that title that while there is kind of a position of power, while there is this responsibility that you must pay back to your students and disciples, the title of Shifu is also something that you don't seek to claim. It is not something that you go out and you achieve and you win and you place upon yourself. It is definitely something that is not only earned by your achievements and not only required by your interactions with people, but it's also something that must be given. Once again, that is the only true version, I think. So we come to the final question of, what do I consider myself? Do I consider myself a Shifu? And I think this question comes up quite a lot, and there's always the interesting interaction I have with students or people, especially people outside of the school, who don't necessarily know the right terminology to refer to people, and you might see my fashion sense and think that I imply a certain title, but no, this is just comfortability. But a lot of people don't know the standard, the context, and so they go for what's the most polite. And I've been referred to as, Kung Fu brother, even though they might not train. I've been referred to as coach, instructor, teacher, Daoist monk, Shifu. And I think that in some of those outside casual encounters, it really is up to the guest, what they feel comfortable with, what title they understand enough to freely give. Everything is acceptable in that situation, because these people are outside of the circle, outside of the realm of the lineage, right? And so everything that they're using, the connotation doesn't really have that cultural background, that cultural backbone. It really just has etiquette and politeness attached to it, which I accept, and I think that is fine. Like, there's no real requirement on that relationship, except for being polite and being, good with each other. And so that's kind of a as you feel comfortable situation. Within the school, I think there's some standards. I think there's some things that do need to be observed just to maintain that practice, maintain that discipline. But also it creates a bond between people within the lineage. If I have Kung Fu brothers, we refer to each other as the title, there's this affirmation, there's this connection that happens, because we're just not two people having a conversation. We're two people that share a history. We're two people that share a reputation and share an experience. And I think that is important to observe in those situations. Now, whether or not I feel that I am a Shifu, I think is irregardless. But I do not think that I am at that stage in my transmission, in my self-cultivation, in my own practice. I don't have the required things. I don't have my own school. I don't have my own ordained disciples. And it's not really my requirement upon my own students. It's not something that I seek to have, because I want people to understand the implications of it first as well. But also I need time to prepare for that responsibility as well. I hope that someday I get to that point where people freely bestow the title upon me. But I think that relationship from master to disciple is a good one to emulate in any relationship, because we're going to build character. We're going to grow and guide people on both ways. And so it's a way to humble yourself. It's a way to respect each other and to move forward, regardless of if you're using the title or not. I think just having that understanding and that kind of awareness between relationships is very important. So I think that it bears a lot of weight, and it just shouldn't be taken for granted. Like I said, it's not something that you just accomplish. It's not an achievement. There are forms of that. If you have a structure, if you have a school and disciples, okay, yeah, you're definitely fitting the standard. You kind of have to. But I think when that time comes, it will either be apparent or it will be apparent to the guest. It'll be apparent to the disciple or the student. For now, I am very comfortable just to prepare myself for that day. And in the meantime, I'm happy to say that I am enjoying walking the path with fellow companions. So, to continuing that journey, I hope that we continue to find balance, one cup at a time. Thank you for tuning into today's episode. Subscribe and join me every Tuesday for new episode releases, also available wherever you get your podcasts. Support the Ways of Wudang through Patreon and get access to resources, classes, and more. Keep the conversation going with hashtag Talks-Unfiltered or connect with me directly by joining the Ways of Wudang on Discord. Links are in the description. I'll talk with you next time for another cup of tea.